Welcome to the Black Line Blueprint, the podcast that helps busy athletes and active adults train smart, recover faster, and perform at their best both physically and mentally. If you're looking for simple, proven ways to increase performance without living in the gym, you're in the right place. I'm Coach Frederick, and today we're diving into injury prevention and durability. Let's get right into it. So, to give you a little heads up, this is going to be a two-part series. So the first part, we're going to talk about 4 of the principles, and then the second half, we're going to talk about the last 3 principles. And this is just going to give you a framework that you can use to prevent those overuse injuries, which there are injuries that you can prevent, which are the overuse ones. But sometimes you can't prevent acute injuries, and those are the ones that you're trying to be more durable and resilient with. So the ones that you can bounce back from when you have those unexpected acute injuries, like if you were to step into a hole and you rolled your ankle. So these are just principles and some guidelines that I follow when writing workouts for my clients over the years. So first part, let's get into it. It's going to be reps and sets and rest. Okay. So generally speaking, with the reps, you want to begin with higher repetitions whenever you're starting a training program. Even if you've been training for an extended period of time, you want to start a new training program or a new training cycle with higher reps. What do I mean by higher reps? In between 8 to 12 reps, especially with these compound movements. So what that's going to do is it's going to allow you to build some technical proficiency in those movements, and it's going to allow your tendons, your ligaments, your joint capsules, your bones, all of those other tissues to catch up to your muscle and your neuromuscular system, because those systems adapt pretty fast, comparatively speaking, to those other systems. So if you jump too soon to the lower repetitions, somewhere, let's just say you go below 5 repetitions way too soon, then you're going to be putting a lot of stress on your ligaments, tendons, bones, etc. And that's when you can potentially get those overuse injuries or some minor acute injuries, because you didn't give those tissues time to adapt and build up the strength that it needs to be able to handle those loads later on down the line. Now, if you're, let's just say, a late beginner in resistance training, you've been training for some time now, maybe like a year or so, but you never really followed a full body resistance training plan consistently, then you definitely want to do that for some months, actually. So the months will allow you to first learn the movements, like I said before, the technical proficiency, and then also allow your system, your tissues, in order to catch up to be able to handle and express some load and heavier with higher intensities of loading. So the lower loads, typically, I don't even if you're in this category and your sport isn't a gym sport, right? You're not participating in powerlifting, Olympic weightlifting, or some type of functional fitness competitions, then you don't need to go to the lower repetitions. The risk reward there isn't necessarily beneficial. So I don't go any lower than about 3 repetitions for the strength work that I do with my clients, because they can still build a lot of strength with that rep range. So typically we would stay between the 8 to 12 rep range. If I can give you an example, if we're starting off with back squats for one training cycle, right? And we do 10 reps for 3 sets, and we do that for those 4 weeks. And then the next 4 weeks, we may change that to a front squat, and we might still do 10 reps for 4 weeks or so, 3 sets. And then the next training cycle, we might do maybe Zercher squats. And then we can probably like reverse engineer that and do Zercher squats, front squats, and then back squats, because we can lift more load with the back squat. But we're not getting into prescriptions here. But this will allow you to learn technical proficiency with all these different type of squat patterns, as well as allow your other tissues to catch up, like I said before. Now, if you're a little bit more advanced, you can start to mess around with those numbers. And that was just one way of doing it. There's plenty of other ways to do it, but you can mess around with those numbers. Maybe the first month with back squats, you do 10 reps. The next month, you do 8 reps or even 6 reps. And then the next month, you do even 7 reps or even 5 reps, or maybe even hit into the 3 rep range. So you can do that over the course of those 3 months. And by that time, you should be feeling okay. The biggest indicator of whether or not you're pushing it too much is how your body's responding, right? Like if you're starting to consistently have joint aches in your knees, you're probably doing too much too soon. for that particular movement pattern. So back off and then work your way back forward. So, and that's typically it for the reps. Now going into the sets, and I stayed on the reps a little bit longer than I thought I was going to go. I don't normally go above like 3 to 4 sets for a particular exercise, and I want to say this because it's very big in the strength world is like 5x5, right? And that was a good starting point for some, but we don't necessarily need 5x5 if you're like a late beginner or an advanced beginner trainee or even intermediate, because most of the athletes that I've actually worked with, they don't really have that much experience in the weight room. And if they do, they're more advanced and they know how to adjust their training from there. But the majority of you will be in that advanced beginner to intermediate range. So I typically keep the sets between 3 to 4 high quality sets. So like I said before, 3x10, you have to be able to push the weight, and you'll be able to get a good training effect from it. If you don't push the weight, then you're still not going to get a training effect, whether you do 5, 6, or 7 sets. So push the weight and you can still get a good training effect from 3 to 4 sets. So the reason why we keep these sets lower is, again, it's lowering the overall fatigue that's going to transfer from day to day. So let's just say if you're more fatigued when you go into, let's just say your sport that you're participating in. If you're a fighter, you're going into a sparring session and you're more fatigued, that just leads you to potentially injure yourself. If you're a runner and you're going out for your runs and you're heavily fatigued, that's going to make your times a lot slower and break down or put more stress on, let's say, your knees and your hips or your ankles or whatnot. And you can name any sport that you want to name. But if you go out and participate in that sport at a fatigue level, it's going to just predispose you to more chances of having an overuse injury and potentially an acute injury. And I'm not trying to fearmonger here, but I'm just saying, like, be smart about the way that you approach the volume that you do in your training. So that's why I usually keep it between 3 to 4 sets with the volume, and sometimes even 2 sets when it comes to the accessory movements. Now, going into the rest periods. So this is a big issue I see. Like people try and do, because they want to get in their workout so quickly, they try and just do it with the very minimal rest. If they feel like, okay, I caught my breath, then they go right into the next movement. But you want to typically keep your rest periods between 2 to 5 minutes for those big compound movements. So I usually pair my exercises with just about every single athlete that I have and client. So I'll do, let's just say we do a back squat, and then we might rest 90 seconds, and then we'll go into maybe a single arm dumbbell row, and then we'll rest another 90 seconds, and then we're right back up to the back squat. Now, if you need more rest time, then it might be 2 minutes in between each of those movements. So this just allows your body to recover, so that way you can put the same amount of effort into each and every set, or really good intensity to each and every set, so that way you are still getting a good training effect from it. Now, when you take less rest, again, you're in a fatigue state and you're stressing your joints more than they need to be stressed. So that can definitely make you less durable, let's put it that way. If you're just beating your body down in that way, you can go through 3 sets of really high intensity squatting and pulling movements and having good rest periods in between, and feel better than you would if you just decided to try and still push it, but not get as much rest, because you're probably not going to meet your rep requirements of that movement that you set out for yourself because you didn't rest long enough. And you're probably not going to be able to increase the weight per set on the movement. So that's that. Now, moving into part 2, or the second part of this, which is tempo. So if you've ever done a written training program, you may have seen it might be 3 numbers or it might be 4 numbers. Usually I write it out as 4 numbers. So it might be like 3, 0, at 3, 0, x1, or at 3, 0, 1, 1. So it'll be 3 seconds down, 0 seconds at the bottom if we're doing a back squat, and then 1 second on the way up and 1 second at the top. So if we want to manipulate this so that way we can better prepare ourselves for loading, or if we do have an injury, or if we're kind of nursing some achy joints, manipulating this tempo can definitely be a really great tool, and I use this very often. So going slower on the lowering portion. So if you're, again, let's keep with the back squat to make it pretty consistent so I don't jump all over the place and not really know what I'm talking about. So we're going to stay with the back squat. So if you got some achy knees or whatnot, going down a little bit slower, allow your stabilizer muscles to kick in a little bit more efficiently. And the speed of movement. A lot of times the speed of movement can definitely irritate the tendon and the ligament, depending on what type of movement that you're doing. So if you slow it down a little bit, you're going to allow that area to at least reduce some of the inflammation maybe that's going on in there, or just give it a little bit of time to rest and recover as you allow the weeks to continue on. And also the tolerance of your tendons and ligaments. The longer you have the time under tension, you're increasing the time under tension for all of those specific tissues, your muscles, your ligaments, your tendons, your bones, everything. So instead of just speeding through reps, like dive bombing into the bottom of a squat and then you're going back up, making sure you're doing slower tempos. Now, this is only just for a time while you're nursing those nagging aches and chronic soreness or whatnot. But as you build up, of course, if you're trying to do like the heaviest load you possibly can, or if you're getting into dynamic sports and activities, then you want to definitely learn how to produce speed and power more quickly. So, of course, it would be more so on the power spectrum, and we'll talk about that. So pauses as well. So if the bottom part of a squat is like your most vulnerable position, you may want to spend a little bit more time in that position. So you may want to pause in the bottom of the squat for maybe about 3 seconds or so, and then come back up out at the bottom. Same thing for a bench press. If you have some discomfort at the bottom of the bench press, it might be because you're not as engaged as you should be in that position. So let's just say we take the weight down for 3 seconds, and then we hold it on our chest for 3 seconds, and then we press back up with the 1 second at the top. If we do that, then that can allow us to have more control and understand where our joints are positioned during the specific movement. And that can definitely help if our technique is one of the issues, if it's a stability issue that's causing the irritation, or it's the speed of the movement that's causing the irritation. And there's another thing on top of that. When we take these tempos and we increase the time under tension with higher tempo movements, we tend to have to use lower loads. So that's going to force us to use a lower load, and taking that load off can definitely help with that achiness that we may have in that specific area. So, moving on to the next one, which is slower concentric. So this is one thing that I had used before because I train a lot of people remotely, and I'm not able to be like, hey, you need to slow the movement down. So with that being said, if we're doing the squat again, I had an athlete who had a back issue, and one of the things that I did was prescribe a 3 seconds down, a 3 second in the bottom, and a 3 second up. It was terrible. It was terrible, but that extremely reduced the weight and refined the movement pattern, and then also allowed the body to understand that it's okay to do this movement pattern, and also how to properly engage during this movement pattern. Because again, it's the speed of the movement. A lot of times, especially when you get like some acute strain that you have in your back, or in your quad, or whatever it may be, if we can slow the movement down, oftentimes we're able to tolerate it a lot more. So, and I already said like it, doing the slower tempos allows the load management to be a lot better too. All right. So next portion is exercise selection. So with the exercise selection, I always say it's not that sexy exercises, because there's a lot of those on social media. There's a lot of sexy exercises out there that look cool, but for the most part, most people can't perform those movements correctly, and also they don't do what they claim they can do. So the thing that I'm trying to point out here is you want to choose exercises that are appropriate for you in your situation, so that modifies for past injuries. So if you have limited mobility, so let's just say you have limited overhead mobility or whatnot, you want to make sure that you're not forcing yourself into that position often. Like, let's say you're doing a pull-up and you're going into the bottom of the pull-up. If you have limited overhead mobility and you are loading that up a lot, then you could potentially be putting more stress on your shoulder joint over time. That tends to wear down, and then that's when you start to have that achiness that goes on there. Same thing for a squat. If you have poor hip mobility and you're trying to force yourself into these squat positions over and over again with a high amount of volume, maybe even you're forcing weight on, then you're just setting yourself up for, disaster. So you want to modify these movements. So the same thing can go for stability. If you don't have really good overhead stability, like I saw like one of the exercises that people would often put up as one of the exercises to do to develop power as a fighter, it would be like single arm hang dumbbell snatches or single arm dumbbell snatches from the ground. And the majority of the fighters that I've worked with do not have good overhead mobility. So that is a terrible selection for the majority of them. So that's what I mean. If you just go off of an exercise that you see, it's just like, oh, that looks simple enough and that looks pretty cool. Let me do that one. But you didn't consider your mobility limitations. So you always got to consider that too. Now, full range of motion. So again, if you lack range of motion, you can choose to substitute those movements that you still need to, let's just say you still need to press. Instead of trying to press overhead, maybe you press with the incline. Maybe you just do horizontal pressing instead. So doing like movements like bench press, dumbbell bench press instead of overhead presses. And maybe you do lateral raises if you still want to build up your delts a little bit more for endurance. Instead of, I can't press overhead, I'm going to do lateral raises. So there's always options, and you got to think about what are the alternatives that's not going to put so much stress on that joint that's going to potentially not allow me to perform in my sport as frequently as I should because my shoulders are pretty much worn down now from pushing through mobility limitations. So the next thing is also taking all your movements through full ranges of motion. Seeing people do partial range of motion. If you're training for bodybuilding competition or something like that, which if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably not. So, but to just understand that those partial range of motion movements are typically reserved for like really trying to isolate certain muscle groups and get a certain look or whatnot. And maybe in rehab, if you can't go to a full depth, and we're going to get into that, then you do partial range of motion. But you want to take all your movements through its full range of motion, because you are trying to train and build strength in the range of motion that you're going through. So if you don't go through that full entire range of motion, let's just say you're doing grappling or whatnot, and then you go on the ground and you don't have that strength in that deep hip flexion range of motion, let's just say somebody's in a guard or a butterfly guard or something like that, then it's going to be pretty hard for you to push out of that safely because you never actually build that strength in that range of motion. So that's just like one example, and there's plenty of others too, right? So if you're playing, let's just say beach volleyball, for instance, and you're reaching up overhead and you're going back to serve, when that ball comes in contact with your hand at that point, that's a lot of force and impact at a very in-range position. If you never train that strength in that position or stability in that position, then it may put a lot more stress on that joint than you would like. So you always want to make sure that you're training at the end ranges that you do have, and also do partial range of motions or modified ranges of motion with certain movements as you increase your mobility in those limited ranges of motion. Now, when partial range of motion is useful, is for reducing soreness. So instead of, let's just say, regular deadlifts, maybe you do a trap bar deadlift. Same thing for squats. You can do a trap bar deadlift for squats as well. But for squats, let's say instead of a full depth back squat, maybe we do box squats. So for a lot of the athletes that are trained, if we're going into competition, we may, instead of doing our full depth squats, now we transition into box squats. The reason why we do that, we reduce the eccentric load, which reduces the muscle damage, which reduces the soreness from the next day to the next day. So reducing range of motion of movements definitely helps with reducing overall soreness. So if you do participate in your sport a lot throughout the week, then you want to try and choose movements that you don't necessarily train heavy with that much volume in partial ranges of motion here and there. But again, still make sure you expose yourself to full range of motion movements. But this is just a way to reduce soreness and allow you to go into that sport with fresh legs, fresh arms, a fresh body. All right. So next thing with exercise selection is complexity of movements. I already kind of mentioned this, but when you're just starting off with like your resistance training, you're just learning it, you want to keep the movements as simple as possible, less moving parts. So stable lift. So instead of doing single leg RDLs, maybe you're doing just dumbbell RDLs. And then you can advance to staggered stance RDLs, and you're still getting a good single leg effect. I know one of the biggest things in the athletic realm is to do single leg movements. So if you're a beginner, you can still do single leg-ish movements, but I like to do more of a staggered stance with those hinge movements, and then maybe even just a split squat stance with some of the lunge movements. But you want to keep it as simple as possible so that way you can get the best training effect from it. The more instability that a movement does have in it, the less force you can produce from that movement, thus the less strength you're going to gain from that movement in general. So if you see somebody doing a single leg goblet pistol squat or something like that, just know that there's a lot of instability that goes along with it and a lot of mobility requirements as well. So if you do lack mobility, if you do lack stability and you're learning the movement for the first time, it's not going to be the best exercise for you, even though you may have saw like, oh, this is the best single leg strength exercise. Maybe for that person, for whatever they're trying to train for. But you remember, you always got to choose the best exercise for you and where you are at the moment. Now, as you progress, you can progress to more advanced movements, or you can just load up the movements more. So let's just say you do a goblet split squat for 4 weeks, and then you do a dumbbell split squat with 2 dumbbells in your hand hanging down by your side for another 4 weeks. Then you add a front rack, or not even a front rack. Let's just say you just add more load. You use a barbell now, right? More instability because the barbell, the weight is loaded out further away from your body, and you can load it up heavier because you have a barbell on your back. Now you're doing a back rack split squat. So you just advanced that exercise because you allowed yourself to be able to load it up more. Now, if you don't have access to a barbell, you can still load that movement up more. Maybe use use wrist wraps and heavier dumbbells or heavier kettlebells or whatnot. So you can always progress the exercise by just progressing the load that you use with it and how much you can load the movement. Now, the next part is alternate movements for recovery. So here are some things like whenever it gets closer to a competition, or if somebody's like, again, if they have some type of achy injury that really doesn't do well with eccentrics, maybe we'll do movements that are more concentric focused. So think of eccentric focus would be something like a reverse lunge, right? Or a reverse lunge. And then a concentric focus movement will be something like a step up, right? Because the majority of the movement is going to come from the step up, unless you have you're doing a really slow lower, which most people don't. Other movements, sled pushes, trap bar deadlifts, they have very little eccentric loading in those movements, and you have a lot more concentric loading in those movements. So those are other movements that help because they have less eccentric load, less muscle damage, and you'll have faster recovery from those movements as well. Less soreness going into the next training day. All right, finally, we are heading into the periodization section here. So basically just planned variation in training in your training. So this stress prevents overload, manages fatigue, and optimizes long-term progress. So why does periodization matter? It matters because, random programming, you really don't get much from that. It's just unpredictable stress, and it just introduces a greater chance of overuse injuries because you're not tracking anything. And I see this very often in a lot of spaces that don't really have a formal way of approaching training. So, and you can definitely get this in recreational sportings, right? Like you'll find, let's just say if you're a runner, you'll find a run program online, and then maybe you'll be like, okay, I know how to bodybuild, so I'll do this. I'll train chest, legs, and all that. And you'll just do that along with your running program. But the issue is there's no cohesion between the two because they're not, you can't manage the volume between both of those correctly because you don't know how much is going into each of those programs. Those programs were designed specifically for the basis of bodybuilding to build your body, that running program to improve your running for whatever distance it said. And let's just say you have a leg day and then the next day you're supposed to do like 1,000 meter intervals or whatnot. You're probably not going to perform those intervals as good as you possibly could. And also your legs, hips, knees, ankles are probably going to be pretty banged up after that day or during that session. So you always want to make sure that you have some type of training structure that's in alignment together. So like for one of the guys that I train that does a lot of running right now, I see what he does on his run days, but then I adjust the training based on when the volume does increase when we're getting closer to a race. So if we're further away from a race, then the volume of certain leg exercises can be a little bit higher, and also the intensity can be higher. But as we get closer to a race and the volume increases and he's peaking of running, then we reduce that overall volume. It's the same thing with the movements as well. So we might reduce the volume of quad strengthening exercises because you're getting a lot of quad loading during your running. So we don't want to overload that movement pattern. So it's just planning, basically. The periodization part is just making sure you're having proper planning in your training. So sometimes you have higher volume in a training block, and then sometimes you have lower volume in a training block. The higher volume blocks, let's just say if you're not really competing and you're just training for balanced fitness and to be capable in your sport, at times we may have higher volume so that way we can build capacity. So you're building the capacity of your legs to handle the impact of running over an extended period of time, or to handle jumping up and down during volleyball, or if you're playing flag football, basketball, jiu-jitsu, whatever you're doing, you're building up the capacity for your body to be able to handle those things. And you want to have that higher volume, higher repetition range earlier on, so that way your tissues can all get a good training stimulus over that course of time. So the lower blocks, so recovery and expression. So the lower training volume blocks, where you're going to be doing probably even heavier loads, are the times where maybe you're about to compete in maybe a flag football tournament, or you're just doing more of your recreational sport, or you do have a competition coming up. You lower the overall volume in your actual strength training sessions or your resistance training sessions, so that way you can recover and actually fully express what your potential is for that sport. Because when you have a lot of fatigue on your body, you're not actually expressing what you're capable of. You're just training at the moment. But when you reduce that fatigue down from the training stressors, then you allow your body to be able to express what it's fully capable of. So typically, you're going to always alternate between the two to reduce the stress on the joints, because if you stay too long in the low training phase, because you might stay there because you're just like, dang, I'm getting really strong, I need to continue with this. But you have to back off at times because, again, like I said before, the muscles and the nervous system can get really good at producing a lot of force. But if those joints and ligaments and tendons aren't up to par with that area, then you're just, setting yourself up for some achiness the next day. So you definitely want to modulate what you do. And the simple answer is you can go from, if you're earlier on, you're more of a beginner, you keep with the high volume for a while, and you just reduce the volume as you get closer to competing in a competition or whatnot. And then you go back to your high volume because you need more exposure to those movement patterns. If you're more advanced, then maybe you just go 1 month, you do higher volume. The next month, you do a little bit lower volume. The next month, a little bit lower volume. And then you just repeat that cycle again. And you just keep going through those training blocks. That is a simple way of doing it. We kind of call it like a accumulation phase, an intensification phase, and I want to say it's like I forget realization phase. Because there's so many different ways to call it. Like I made it up myself. I'm just like, yeah, I like accumulation, intensification, but then I want something that sounds pretty cool. Realization. Yeah, that works. So realization, you're actually realizing your potential, right? So with that accumulation phase, you're doing higher repetitions, building your capacity, building your durability. The intensification phase, you're getting a lot stronger. You're starting to tap into your power development a little bit more. You're reducing some of the muscle endurance stuff. And it also depends on your sport or your hobby. And then the realization phase, you're stripping down a lot of the excess and you're allowing yourself to express what you need to express for whatever endeavor you're trying to accomplish there. Okay. And I think I covered just about everything I needed to cover in that section too. All right. So that was the periodization phase. So that's it. So we covered the importance of reps, sets, and rest, different ways to manipulate tempo, choosing the correct exercises, and then proper progression with periodization. So that's all I have for you for this one. If you got something from it, share it with somebody that you know. Make sure to subscribe so that way you can keep up to date and you can also catch the next one. All right. So I'll see you in the next one.